Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Stewart, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very important program on the topic of the filibuster, protection for versus tyranny by the minority. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization encouraging informed and active participation in government. Our league in Tucson is celebrating its 80th anniversary this fall. We respectfully acknowledge that the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Tohono O'odham and the Pasquayaqui people. The League of Women Voters is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and strives to build relationships with sovereign nations, Native nations, and Indigenous communities through educational programs, voter outreach, and advocacy. Before we get started in our program today, I'm going to explain the League of Women Voters' position on the filibuster, which has changed recently. On September 27th, the League of Women Voters, the National League in DC, released a press release about how the position had changed. So this is their statement that they released. This week, the Board of Directors of the League of Women Voters of the United States voted unanimously to support filibuster reform and, as necessary, the elimination of the filibuster. LWVUS Board President, Dr. Deborah Ann Turner, issued the following statement. For far too long, an archaic rule has prevented the US Senate from fully functioning and has allowed a minority of senators to block action of the majority. This roadblock runs counter to the heart of our democracy and the will of the people who voted for senators to represent their interests and uphold our democracy. Our democracy faces the challenge of a lifetime. We're at the crossroads with anti-voting laws sweeping the nation and threatening our freedom to vote. We need Congress to take bold action and pass the Freedom to Vote Act now. And that's the new bill that was recently introduced in Congress in September. We cannot wait for another election to pass this by. The League has a history of calling for filibuster reform to ensure a functioning democracy. Today, we take our stance a step further and support the elimination of the filibuster. The filibuster is a relic of the Jim Crow era. It has a long history of use to defend slavery, preserve segregation, and block civil rights. It is time to amend the filibuster to ensure our government can govern for the people. It is time to fix or nix the filibuster and to save our right to vote. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Joan Kaltzis, who is a longtime member of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. So thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Kate, for reminding us of the revised League of position and our land acknowledgement. And hello and welcome everyone out there in Cyberland. Thanks for joining us. It's good to have all of us gathered here this morning or whenever it is that you'll be tuning in to learn about the filibuster. As moderator, there are several points I'd like to share. FCC rules prohibit the recording of this event in any way by anyone but the League. A rerun on this program will be available on Facebook and YouTube in about a week. The links are posted in our chat room, so before you leave today, check them out, copy them down. And questions from our audience can come in easily through the Q&A icon on your computer. Just type in your question and we'll take it from there. And as Kate has reminded us, the League has been in existence for 101 years, a nonpartisan organization. We do not support, oppose, or endorse candidates or political parties in any way, but League has been working tirelessly in studying and taking positions of advocacy on issues and certainly supporting registered, informed, and conscientious voters. Because we know that democracy has to have informed and participating people for it to work. So it makes sense then, if we value ourselves as conscientious and informed voters, that we understand filibustering better. And that we ponder whether the filibuster offers, as per our theme today, protection for the minority or tyranny by the minority. And to raise our interest level a little bit more, a piece of trivia. I didn't know this, maybe you do, but the word filibuster is derived from the Spanish word filibustero, meaning pirate. Pirate. So what's that about? Let's find out. So fortunately, our two outstanding speakers are ready to take us into the world of the filibuster. Each will spend maybe from 15 to 20 minutes presenting her views and information for us to consider. Then we'll gather a bunch of questions for them to answer and to interact with. We'll put as many out there as we have time for before we have to end. And again, I'm suggesting that our audience, please ask your questions by accessing the Q&A button on your computer at any time during the forum. Our time together will move quickly and thoughtfully, and my job as moderator will be to facilitate an open, civil, respectful exchange of information. Okay, so our journey's beginning. First of all, it's my pleasure to briefly introduce our first speaker. Barbara Norrander has been a professor at the U of A in the School of Government and Public Policy since 1990. Barbara, George H.W. Bush was president then, for heaven's sakes. She has degrees from Minnesota, Oregon, and the Ohio State Universities. Barbara's a prolific author of countless published books and articles, as evidenced by a curriculum vitae that's 16 pages long. In the last 3 years, she's been cited 75, 115, and 81 times in published works. Last year, Barbara was awarded the Outstanding Professional Achievement Award from the Midwest Women's Caucus Midwest Political Science Association. And Professor Norrander's research focuses on US elections, public opinion, election laws, voters' decision-making, and the gender gap among voters. So Barbara is going to condense a whole course on filibustering into our next 20 minutes. Well worth our time, and we don't have to pay any tuition. So Professor Norrander, if you please.
Okay, thank you for asking me to make a presentation. And so I was asked to talk about the history of the filibuster, and I have put together a combination of information on the filibuster and things that are related to it. So starting at the beginning, what's in the Constitution? Well, the Constitution, the first article is about Congress, and it's the longest section of the Constitution, but it's really vague about the procedures for the House of Representatives and Senate. It basically leaves them up to the people who will be parts of those organizations. So the Constitution says there should be a Speaker of the House. It says that the Vice President would serve also as the President of the Senate and could vote to break ties. It says that there should be a President pro tem when the Vice President's absent. The Vice Presidents actually did spend a lot of time over in the Senate during the 1800s, but not so much today. It says that bills have to be passed by the House and the Senate, and it talks about the veto procedures. It says that the House, both houses should keep a journal. And what's most important, it says that each house will determine its own rules of proceedings. So there's a lot that's not in the Constitution. It never mentions political parties. It never talks about a committee system. Most of the leaders of Congress are not mentioned, and it doesn't talk about how the House and the Senate would proceed on their floor debates or the amendment process or voting. And of course, it doesn't talk about the filibuster. So why is there a filibuster in the Senate? Well, the Senate has this right of recognition rule that's very ancient in terms of it's been around for a long time. And with this right of recognition, if no other senator is speaking, the chair must recognize the senator. So the chair has no discretion in being able to recognize or not recognize a particular speaker. So there's also some rules about how long individuals can speak and how many times they can speak, but generally they are loose enough that they could have, again, that long-winded filibuster. Bills in the Senate are brought to the floor under unanimous consent agreements, and as the term suggests, if one person objects to this unanimous consent, that can prevent a bill from making its way to the floor. So the earliest Senate sessions would end debate by moving the previous question, but it was rarely used. And so Vice President Aaron Burr, acting as the president of the Senate, called the procedure unnecessary. So in the next year, the Senate dropped it, but didn't replace it with any method for ending a long-winded speech. So for the 1800s, there was no method to end a filibuster, but there weren't very many filibusters at the time. So fewer than 24. The first recorded filibuster was in 1841, and it was over the printing of the Congressional Globe. At the time, things like printing were a big deal in Congress. And they had a filibuster that was very nasty and lasted for 6 days. And as was suggested by the introduction, the term filibuster appears around the 1850s. So as you get closer to the 20th century and the first part of the 20th century, filibusters became more frequent for a couple of reasons. There were a lot of states added to the Union in the late 1800s, which meant you have more senators. And after 1913 and the constitutional amendment, these senators would now be elected, which probably gave them more incentive to pay attention to what's happening in the Senate and try to push their positions. And the federal government started to do more as you get to the 20th century. So there was no procedure in the 1800s to bring a filibuster to the close. You got the change in the beginning of the 20th century. As there were more filibusters, it became a little bit more unworkable. And sort of the straw that broke the camel's back was when Woodrow Wilson wanted to arm US merchant ships, which were being harassed and more by the German submarine warfare before we were part of World War I, but it was blocked by 12 anti-war senators. So Congress passed the ability to end a filibuster with 2/3 vote of the members of the Senate. And it was first used with the Treaty of Versailles. But the closures were rarely successful because it did require that 2/3 majority. And just if you're wondering, the longest individual speech in a filibuster was by Strom Thurmond against the Civil Rights Act of 1957. So that brings up the question of how many times was the filibuster used on civil rights issues? So the best source of this is the book by Sarah Binder and Stephen Smith, two political scientists who are experts on Congress. And they looked at bills that would have passed if not for the filibuster. And they found that there were about 30 measures that were prevented from becoming law because of the filibuster. And about half of those were on civil rights issues, things like lynching and poll taxes and housing and rental discrimination. And the first successful filibuster against an attempt to prevent a civil rights bill was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which successfully had a cloture vote. In the 1800s, before there was a cloture procedure, there were about 40 filibusters, and 10 of those were on racial issues. Sort of jumping forward, bills that have been blocked by filibuster since 2000. So Republican bills that were blocked by Democrats include an attempt to make it more difficult to bring class action lawsuits, to add more restrictions to the welfare program, repealing the estate tax, and some additional abortion restrictions. Democratic bills blocked by the Republicans include additional strengths for bargaining, increased requirements for campaign expenditures, greater abilities for women to demonstrate pay discrimination, and the DREAM Act, which would have provided a pathway to citizens for undocumented immigrants brought to the US as children. There were some significant changes in the filibuster rules in recent decades. So in 1975, they changed the number of votes that are needed for a filibuster. So the 2/3 vote, which would possibly be 67 votes, was very difficult to achieve. So they switched it to 3/5 of all senators, which would normally be 60 votes. That's why we hear about the 60 votes as being important in recent years. Still, there were problems in presidents getting their nominations of executive and judicial branches through the Senate, because only the Senate confirms these types of offices. So in 2013, the Democratic majority changed the procedure for most of the executive branch nominees and the judicial nominees other than the Supreme Court, so that they could be confirmed by a simple majority vote. And in 2017, the Supreme Court nominees were added to this list of things that could be passed by majority vote. And that was done by the Republican majority. So there are actually two types of filibusters. A lot of times when we're thinking of filibusters, we think back to that old movie with Jimmy Stewart giving the long speech to prevent the passage of the bill. That's called a talking filibuster. They're no longer talking filibusters. But with a talking filibuster, one senator or a group of senators would work together to have extended debates, lengthy debates, trying to prevent the bill from being passed. There were a number of procedures and requirements. Senators needed to remain standing during the speech and speak continuously, although again, a group of senators could work together to continue the filibustering by talking for long periods of time. Today we have silent filibusters. So again, back in the 1970s, they changed it so that there are now 2 tracks for bills getting to the floor of the Senate. So that means if a bill is filibustered or threatened to be filibustered, it can be set aside and Congress can go on to other legislation. Reforms often have unintended consequences, and the unintended consequence of going to silent filibusters is that it increased the number of filibusters because there were fewer costs to those who were supporting the filibusters. In particular, they weren't going to alienate other senators by making those senators camp out in their office in case there was a quorum call. So the cloture vote is what could be used to end the filibuster. Again, it's Senate Rule 22, and the procedure is that 16 senators present a motion to end the debate. They usually don't vote on that particular motion until 2 session days later. A session day is not necessarily a calendar day. And it typically requires 60 votes. However, it doesn't end all of the debate. There's additional up to 30 hours of discussion. Importantly, it does limit the kinds of amendments that can be offered. The amendments have to be germane to the subject of the legislation, and they have to be submitted in writing prior to the cloture vote. You can get the effects of a filibuster without a formal filibuster. Just the threat of a filibuster may lead the majority leader to decide not to bring the vote to the floor of the Senate, or the proponents of the bill may agree to some of the conditions of the people who are conducting a potential filibuster. There are a number of components or types of legislation that's not subject to a filibuster. As mentioned before, executive and judicial nominees of the president basically now are confirmed by a 50 vote. The budget reconciliation bill that we keep hearing about is also not subject to a filibuster. And this is a procedure for the House and Senate to agree on where money should be spent. Some other areas that are not subject to a filibuster are trade agreements, military base closures, arms sales. Molly Reynolds has written a book about these limitations. She found 161 exceptions. I don't know what all those 161 exceptions are, but you can consult her book if you want to know more about that. So the budget reconciliation has become more of an important tool of Congress as the filibuster started to be used more frequently. So in this particular article, they pointed out that there's been 22 policies which have been enacted since 1980 using the budget reconciliation so that these pieces of legislation could be passed by 50 votes. You can see that it was for the creation of the new welfare system called TANF, several times for deficit reduction bills, several times to have tax cuts. The final portion of the Affordable Care Act was gone through the budget reconciliation process, and various attempts by the Republicans to repeal ACA, although those were not successful. And of course, most recently, the American Rescue Plan was passed through a budget resolution, which included the extension of the unemployment, the expansion of the child tax credit, the additional checks to Americans, and aid to local and state governments. So as mentioned before, the filibuster has been increasingly used in recent decades. The way they tend to count the filibusters is the number of times cloture was attempted. You can see that there's almost no dots until you get around to the 1970s. And again, that is when they changed over to the silent filibuster. So again, the silent filibuster increased the opportunities for filibusters by making them less onerous to other members of Congress. This is also an area where we've had polarization of the parties in Congress. So there are more policy differences, which would lead one party to try to prevent the other party from getting its legislation passed. And sometimes it's symbolic opposition to the other party. Also, typically in the past couple of decades, the majorities in Congress have been pretty slim. And so what happens is that the minority party thinks, well, if we can just sort of stall things until the next election, we will become the majority party and we will be able to have legislation that we prefer. And of course, some senators do these filibusters for media attention. So again, the consequences of these increasing filibusters is that they're putting more and more items into that budget reconciliation, but they can't do everything. It has to be sort of a monetary type policy. So the parliamentarian ruled earlier in this session that DACA, the procedure to protect deportation of children brought to the US as individuals brought to the US as children, didn't qualify to be under a budget reconciliation. Also, by packing everything into these budget reconciliation bills, we're losing the policy expertise that's built up in the committee system. So members of Congress tend to get on a committee and they stay there for their career. And as they stay there, they develop more expertise on that policy area. But if we're bypassing the committee system to put together these big budget reconciliation packages, we're losing that expertise that Congress has. In addition, fewer policies are being passed. So in the 115th Congress, there were lots of filibusters, but only 52 pieces of legislation that passed by recorded vote. But again, some of these pieces of legislation are much bigger. And as Congress has been unable to pass legislation, presidents have been using their executive powers more to create policies. But these policies can then be overturned by the next president. So, this will be discussed later, but there's a variety of techniques to reform the filibuster. Obviously, it could be eliminated in its entirety. They could carve out more policy areas where the filibuster is not allowed. Or they could change the voting rules. So now you have to have 60 votes to overturn a filibuster. But they could require that people who are doing the filibuster have sufficient votes to show that their support. So having to have 41 senators vote to continue the filibuster. So you might ask why there's no filibuster in the House of Representatives. Well, back in the 1800s, they did not eliminate that vote on the previous question and redefined it as a way to end the debate. The other factor is that the House floor is much more regulated by rules than the Senate floor. And every piece of legislation that's going to make its way to the House floor, at least every major piece of legislation, has to go through what's called the Rules Committee. And this Rules Committee, made up of members of both the majority party and the minority party, make the decisions about how this piece of legislation will be handled on the floor of the House of Representatives. So they set the length of the debate. And typically the debate time is very limited on the House side. It may be 2 hours, with each side getting 1 hour each to present their positions. The Rules Committee also determines what kinds of amendments could be allowed to the legislation once it's on the floor of the House. An open rule would allow any amendment that's germane to the topic of the legislation. A closed rule doesn't allow any amendments, and a modified open rule is allowing some amendments. The closed rule has become much more dominant in the rule procedures for the House of Representatives in the past couple of decades. So there's a very distinct way that legislation is regulated as it makes its way to the House floor, while at the Senate side, it's unanimous consent agreements, which allows one senator to object and to prevent the movement of bill to the Senate floor. Finally, you might ask, what does the American public have to say? Well, a lot of people really don't know that much about the filibuster. So you can see that 39% did not have an opinion in this poll, which is actually a very good polling firm that was done. So it's a good question, and it was a good sample. And you see that 39% didn't have an opinion. A lot of Americans don't have opinions on technical kinds of issues or procedures by which things are done. In terms of the people who did have opinion, it's pretty evenly split between people who favor eliminating the filibuster and those who want to maintain it. So that's basically what I have to say. There's a couple of slides that talk about where I got this information, but that's where we stand in terms of the filibuster.
Okay, Barbara, a lot of information. Thank you so much for that. You just laid a foundation here. So, okay, we're moving on. Our second speaker comes to us via Zoom, of course, from the great state of Maryland. Charly Carter is described as a battle-tested organizer, a movement maker, a political strategist, a leader builder, an urban planner, an urban farmer, excuse me, Charly, and simply as lightning. Charly originally is from New York and Cornell University's Graduate School of Political Management, but she calls Baltimore her hometown by choice. When she was with the ACLU of Maryland, she led the campaign to win a record $1.2 billion to build 21st century schools for Baltimore's school children. Charly, wow. Okay. 3 years ago, Charly founded Step Up Maryland, an organization dedicated to ending structural racism and transforming the culture of state and local government by turning active citizens into progressive leaders. In May, she became the executive director of Democracy Initiative, a coalition of 75 labor, civil rights, and environmental organizations representing more than 45 million people. So Ms. Carter, we'd love to hear from you, please.
Thank you for having me, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about this important issue at this moment. The DI was formed, the Democracy Initiative was actually formed about 10 years ago when a group of individuals leading the environmental movement, civil rights movement, and workers' rights movements came together to talk about how our country wasn't able to move forward. And no matter what the issue was, it was being frustrated by a Senate minority that decided they were going to use the filibuster on everything. And that brings us here. 10 years later, we're still fighting this fight. And to put it in perspective, the filibuster was just used to block a standard procedure that would allow the nation to raise its debt ceilings and pay its bills. Bills not being created by this president, but bills that have are due from policies passed under previous Congresses and presidents. I don't think this was the idea that we would block our country from operating, paying its bills, and maintaining its economy and the faith in its word and in its debts, that we would imagine, they would have imagined the filibuster being used in such a way that would put our country in such a precarious position. Whatever its intent, I think we can all agree that the filibuster, as it's being used to frustrate debate and deliberation, is not in the interest of our democracy. As Dr. Norrander pointed out, we've seen over the last 100 years, well, according to the Brennan Center for the filibuster has been used about 2,000 times since 1900 till today. 1,000, half of that, or 1,000 times, the filibuster has been used to just in the last 12 years. And that filibuster is not just the formal blocking cloture or blocking debate on a bill. It is also the way the filibuster is used today is that the threat of a filibuster can even prevent debate itself. So if the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is a good example. Speaker Pelosi has not released, had been refusing to pass the bill out of the Congress and move it on to the Senate because of the threat of the filibuster. So in today's, in the Senate today, it's not even, we're not even allowing the discussion of new ideas because without transparency behind closed doors, senators can simply say they're going to either not vote for unanimous consent or imply that they have the 40 votes or 41 votes in order to block debate, to block discussion of an issue, and that's not really working well for our country in any way. We can't even discuss or debate issues is very different than being able to block, being able to end debate and moving on to vote on it, which was the original intent of the filibuster rule. So what can we do about it? The Democracy Initiative, we want to fix or nix the filibuster. And as Dr. Norrander suggested, that means either eliminating the filibuster rule in itself, which requires a vote of 2/3 of the Senate to go along. And if we are having a difficult time getting to 60 votes, the idea of getting to 66 votes is an even more daunting task. So we realize that that's a pretty steep hurdle for us to accomplish. But there are several ways that have been discussed recently about how we can fix the filibuster. And one discussion has been a return to the talking filibuster. And that is making it harder for individual senators or the minority leader to just suggest the invoking a filibuster, or making it harder than just sending an email to the majority leader's office saying that they intend to filibuster a bill, but actually making them put on a defense defend their position for opposing cloture and holding the floor, being present, as Dr. Norrander says, requiring all the other senators being present. But most importantly, it removes the anonymity behind blocking debate and discussion on an issue. So as Dr. Norrander said, a lot of times we'll have leaders who'll stand up and proclaim that they are going to filibuster a bill because they want to get the cameras focused on them. But that's very different than having them being a senator who is voting with the minority to block cloture and having to stand up on the floor and in front of all the cameras and the media tell the world why you think we should be, why voting rights are not important and why we should be restricting some people from voting. As we saw in the debate over the Affordable Care Act, removing the Affordable Care Act proved a lot harder than the claims that people were making about removing the Affordable Care Act when it came time to people actually standing up and voting against the interests of their constituents who actually found it very popular. We saw a lot fewer senators willing to publicly stand up and oppose the measure or vote against it. We can also, as Dr. Norrander talked about, the reconciliation process. One fix has been considered is to change what can be the rules around what can be considered as part of a budget reconciliation, and to expand the definition. That is an avenue that some senators are currently looking at. Another Another fix could be expanding the carve-outs. So as Dr. Norrander said, in 2013, the Senate voted to carve out presidential nominations. That is after President Obama's nominations were filibustered in 2009. That they changed the rules in 2013 to say you couldn't filibuster nominations. And then in 2017, after the Senate minority blocked the nomination of Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland, the confirmation, I should say, they blocked the confirmation of Merrick Garland with a filibuster. The Senate majority came back in 2017 and amended the filibuster rule to exempt, Supreme Court nominees. And thus, Senator Mitch McConnell was able to ensure that President Trump got to put 3 people on the Supreme Court after denying President Obama the appointment of a single Supreme Court justice through the use of the filibuster. Those are because the filibuster is now used to block both votes to end debate on a bill, but also can block introduction of a bill for debate. It's resulted in gridlock in Congress. And it coincides, there's a direct correlation between the increased use of the filibuster over the past 12 years and the decline in public opinion about Congress and the federal government and its effectiveness in public opinion. And so we really, at this moment, with so many crises coming to bear, we're in a position where we really, now is the time that we really need to, as the public, understand what the filibuster is, understand what's creating the gridlock in Washington, and urge our senators to change the rules. And it's going to take all of us weighing in to make that happen, particularly in Arizona, where the current, where Senator Sinema believes that that it leads to more cooperation and discourse. The evidence has shown that, as shown by the filibuster of the debt ceiling vote, that the filibuster is now used just primarily to score political points and for posturing. And our country just cannot afford that any longer. I'll stop there, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Okay, Charlie. Ms. Carter, thank you. A lot of information also. We appreciate it all. So, time for questions, all of which will be coming in, and both of our panelists are welcome, and we encourage you both to respond and interact regarding the questions. Again, our audience, send them to us using the Q&A button on your computer, and we'll ask as many as we have time for. So let me just start here with a question that needs to be clarified a bit more. What would happen if the filibuster rule was abolished in the current US Senate? And if this happens and the Democrats get rid of the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation, can the next Congress repeal these voting rights with a simple majority? Professor, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, so the current Congress, if there was no filibuster, the Senate could pass legislation technically with 51 votes. So Vice President Harris would be over on the Senate side much more often to break the tie votes. And the next Congress could change that. So if the Republicans were the majority in the Senate after the 2022 elections, they could vote to repeal the legislation that the Democrats passed in this session.
Ms. Carter?
I agree with what Dr. Norrander said. I think there are a couple of things. Right now, as she mentioned in her presentation, we have legislation by executive order. And so a lot of things that there's already laws that can be implemented by the president through an executive order that the next president can undo. What I would say is that elimination of the filibuster in this Congress would allow a debate on important issues that are relevant to our country right now. Things like climate change and what we're going to do about it. Things like voting rights that are being stripped at the state level. And what we learned from the Affordable Care Act is that it is much harder, that once a measure passes, it's much harder for people to stand up and repeal those laws after the fact. So I can't imagine any senator that wanting to stand up, well, I can imagine some senators, but it'd be much more difficult for a senator to stand up and argue for stripping people of their voting rights after we've passed laws to affirm those voting rights.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please. How is the Senate rule made? I think we need to go back a little bit and flesh this out a little bit more, Professor, if you could, and then Charlie, if you want to add to it, please.
The Senate technically, usually at the beginning of the 2-year session, will approve the rules that exist. They could change the rules on their own. I'm not sure exactly how many votes that would require, but obviously the Senate has the ability to set its own rules.
Ms. Carter?
I believe that's true, that you need, generally they need 51 votes to change a rule, but the vice president isn't allowed to vote on Senate rule changes. But I also think that they can change rules by introducing precedent. So, and I think Dr. Norrander can probably explain this better than I will, but introducing precedent means questioning the rule that currently exists and providing clarity for how that rule is supposed to be applied through this precedent. And I believe that is how they made the amendments in 2013 and 2017.
Barbara, anything?
No,
Okay, next question, please. Today, the 26 least populous states are home to just 17% of the US population, meaning a group of senators representing a small minority of the country can use the filibuster to prevent the passage of bills with broad public support. Could you comment on this, please? Ms. Carter, could you start?
I will, and this is a conversation that in recent years has grown. There's been the debate over this and this representation issue and whether it violates one man, one vote or representational government. has increased. You know, back in, was it 1906? Mr. Burr, he thought that we really didn't need the filibuster, that there were other tools and procedures available to the Senate so that we didn't have to rely on this rule of allowing the minority to dictate. And I would agree with that. I think that we should, separately from the conversation about the structure of our Senate, need to have the conversation about the filibuster. I do believe, though, we need to have a conversation about the structure of the Senate, but that as well cannot happen as long as we have the minority of senators have the ability to block the vote.
Professor?
Well, to change the composition of the Senate would require a constitutional amendment, which is, again, very difficult to do because that's written into the Constitution that each state has two senators.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please. If one of the exceptions to the filibuster rule pertains to presidential appointments, why is President Biden still waiting for so many of his appointments to be confirmed? Professor?
They're using a procedure called hold, which is similar to a filibuster, but not technically the same. So that also tends to keep things off the record or off from going forward. They could do those, but they have to use some of the more archaic rules that the Senate has that are slower to confirm the nominee.
Okay, Charlie?
I'll defer to the professor on that one.
Okay, next question. Isn't the Senate the single most vulnerable body of government in terms of its susceptibility to obstruction and or manipulation by the minority? You've touched on this a bit, but there's a direct question here. Charlie, please.
Well, the Senate is the only body that has the filibuster rule. As Professor Norrander said, the House eliminated this rule. This rule also doesn't exist at any state legislative level or in any city council or county council legislative body. So I would say, yes, this is true, that it makes the Senate much more vulnerable. And I think, people like to talk about the Senate having been considered the slower, more deliberative body, where the Congress was much more the House of the people and was considered to be much more susceptible to the changing political winds. I think what we're seeing is that is in effect how the Senate works now, is that we have a much more partisan political system, a highly partisan Senate, and the rules around or the political process that governs how people get elected and who gets funded by the Senate PACs really force people to toe the line. And so I think there's much less crossing of party line to have conversations the way many who defend the filibuster like to say, that it's really not a tool to encourage bipartisan discussions. It is really a tool that is about drawing a sign in the land, drawing a line in the sand, and making scoring political points.
Professor?
Well, just the different sizes of the House versus the Senate has traditionally led the House to have many more rules than the Senate does. So the House is trying to coordinate across 435 people and the Senate across 100. And so again, a couple of decades ago, you had more sort of what you might call bipartisanship in the Senate, and it allowed the rules to, the fewer rules that it had to function better.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Some adversaries of filibuster reform maintain the solution to filibuster abuse lies not in the change of Senate rules, but in the behavior of senators themselves. In the first century, and I think we've heard some of this now of its existence, after all, the filibuster was used sparingly, did not routinely paralyze our government, which suggests that today's senators in our current political climate, rather than the filibuster itself, are really the problem. Do you agree or disagree with this audience's assessment, audience members' assessment? Professor?
Well, we do see that the Congress as a whole has become more polarized in the last few decades. So the two parties are moving apart on what they want Congress to do. And that allows senators who are in opposition to what the majority might want to use their full opportunity to prevent those legislation from passing.
Okay, Ms. Carter?
I think that that the way the rules are applied, for example, the move to the silent filibuster has removed transparency, and I think that the conditions that allow people to misbehave, I'll use that term. There are conditions that allow senators to grandstand and to use to exploit the rules. So I think that having much more transparency in around behind the scenes negotiations, around who's doing the blocking of debate and deliberation is a way of controlling the behavior of senators. But I agree with the hyperpolarization is just leads to what we're seeing, the political grandstanding that we're seeing.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. You might pick up this one, next question, Charlie. Is the threat of a filibuster as practiced today actually forcing the majority party to pack unrelated legislation into reconciliation bills?
Well, I think, there are rules around reconciliation bills that say they have to deal with the budget or financial impact. And I think it is changing the way we the emphasis of some policies that are being added to reconciliation bills. And honestly, I think it forces a different discussion than the discussion that our country should be having. DACA being the example is what we really should be talking about, is people who are brought to this country as children who only know this country as their home. We shouldn't be having a dollars and cents conversation about that. That is about our values and our morals. And I think that forcing policies that really should be about our highest selves and the place that we want to see our country go shouldn't just be, we shouldn't just be forced to have dollars and cents conversations around them.
Okay. Professor, please.
Yeah, so they're putting more things into the reconciliation simply because they can get it passed by 50 votes. And they're packing in a lot of things that they can call somewhat monetary. And it does lead to Congress not using the committee system as much and not talking about each individual component as much as they might have in the past.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Next question, please. It has been said that it is absurd to protect the filibuster as some sort of venerable guardian of sound government. Could you both comment on that statement, please? And Professor, would you first?
Okay. There are lots of traditions and lots of rules and things that exist from the past that continue. And people who have benefited or feel that they were successful in the past often think that they should continue to the future.
Charlie?
I agree with what Professor Norrander just said.
Okay. Next question, please. What would be required to eliminate the silent filibuster so that senators would be less likely to filibuster and possibly become more likely to learn to compromise and collaborate? And Charlie, Ms. Carter.
I actually am going to defer to Professor Norrander on this one because she might have a better understanding of exactly how that works.
Okay, Professor, you're up.
I don't know if I know exactly that either. There are lots of obscure rules, both in the House and the Senate, and they have parliamentarians just trying to figure out how they apply. But the dual track that allowed for silent filibusters was put into place under the Democrats and using the changes of their rules at that particular time to develop two tracks. So I assume that they could somehow undo the dual track and bring it back to a talking filibuster.
Okay, there you heard it. Next question, please. Let me find it here. Sorry. Even if we reformed or eliminated the filibuster, isn't this just a quick fix that doesn't address our real problems? And in the absence of a filibuster, wouldn't our senators seek alternative ways to obstruct their opponents' policies? Professor, please.
They are creative. So they would use other procedures. Again, partly what's happening is because the Senate considers things under unanimous consent, objections to that unanimous consent, even if it's not a formal filibuster, could delay or require the Senate to use some procedures which are more cumbersome.
Okay, Charlie, you got any ideas on that?
I think the elimination of the filibuster will actually improve our democracy. I think requiring folks to actually have a debate that actually gets covered by the media, that voters can listen to, weigh in on, I think is healthy for our democracy, even if some of those decisions are things that I don't agree with. I think the problem is that we have a system around, outside of the Senate, we have a system of money in politics and other parts of our political system that want us to limit debate and want senators to, or encourage senators to try to kill policies behind closed doors, for example, instead of just being open and honest about them. I'm not afraid of, what happens to our country if we eliminate the filibuster. I quite honestly think that we will move forward by light years because it removes the secrecy that allows special interests to have in the that allows special interests to have so much influence in our political and our legislative system.
Okay. Professor, you said something on this already, I think,
Mhm.
right? All right, next question, please. From a nonpartisan perspective, are there any noteworthy accomplishments of the Senate that were made possible by the filibuster? Charlie?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I'm going to defer to the professor on this one.
Okay, Professor, from the top of your head, is
okay.
something coming?
Well, so you can think of some of the legislation that was blocked by the filibuster. So if you are a supporter of the Affordable Care Act, the filibuster has made it more difficult to overturn the Affordable Care Act. So if you like prior policies, the filibuster tends to protect prior policies.
Okay. I've bunched several questions together that have to do with certainly the topic that you touched on, both of you, having to do with its racist history. But I'm going to ask them all of the questions, even though some may be a little redundant. Apparently, this is of concern to our audience. So question, first of all, question regarding critics of the filibuster have pointed to its racist history, as both of you have. It was used in the 19th century by pro-slavery senators, and then more recently to block civil rights legislation. Former President Obama called it a Jim Crow relic. Would you agree? And if so, would you like to expound on that a bit? And Professor, please.
So I did have that slide that showed how many pieces of legislation that were on civil rights tended to be blocked. And it was more prevalent after the cloture than before. The other thing that comes into play is that Southern senators often were quite powerful because they were reelected more frequently than senators from other parts of the country. For 100 years, there was basically only the Democratic Party in the South. And so once a senator got elected, they would get reelected. The same thing in the House of Representatives. The committee chairs were often Southerners, again, because they were reelected more often, and seniority determined who controlled the committee system.
Okay. Ms. Carter, what would you like to say about this?
I would say I have to agree. When we look at how the filibuster has been used in recent history, I mean, let's go back to 2009 and the declaration that the Senate would use the filibuster to make sure that President Obama was a one-term president. I don't think, at any point when we talk about Senate rules, were they necessarily envisioned to frustrate the entire agenda of a president, or to advance or hinder a presidency. I think that there was always, though, a level of respect for the office of the presidency, as well as a respect for the office of Senate, to use the filibuster in such a way that it would diminish those roles. But I also think if we look, especially in the last, since 2012, how often the filibuster or threat of the filibuster has been used, that it is overwhelmingly been used to frustrate progress on issues of civil rights, human rights, immigrant rights, and other issues, economic rights, and other issues that might help or have an overwhelmingly large impact on people of color and on women and on young people.
Okay. Thank you, Charly. Next question involving this broad area here. There was an article in the July 2021 New York Times entitled, "Manchin and Sinema Have Their History Wrong," regarding their belief that voting rights bills have to be bipartisan. The article's research shows that the attack on voting rights in this country is and has been partisan. Barbara, you touched on this, well, you did more than touch on it, you went into it. Would you like to pick up again and reiterate or comment on this particular article, which I don't know if you've read or not, but you get the gist of the question.
So the topic of the filibuster is tied to the policy preferences of the people who are engaging in it. And so there has been a difference between the Democratic and Republican parties in recent years about voting procedures and rules for voting. So it's part of it's a tool that those who want to have more rules for voting can use to further that interest.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Carter, comments, please.
Well, I will say that I cannot remember whether I read that article or not, but I can say that attacks on voting rights have definitely been racialized, if not partisan. And I will go back to what Professor Norrander said, is that there was a period of time where it was Democrats in the South who were opposing voting rights or expanding voting rights, and they used their power to restrict rights. And now it happens to be Republicans who are opposing voting rights. But always the target of that, it's never white men or even white women. It has always been the targeted have been Black and brown and young people.
So this next question, and just takes this a bit further, does the filibuster play any role in leading our nation down the path of white minority rule and autocracy? Charly, you want to start with that? Continue on.
I would say it's not leading us down the road to, because that's where we are. I would say that it very much protects the power of a white patriarchal rule of our politics and our legislation. And as other groups grow, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about 17%, the senators, 17% of the population being having sway over the policies of the remaining 83% of the population. I think that rules like the filibuster just will increasingly protect the power of that minority.
Professor, anything?
So we're having more of a geographic kind of division between the two parties in terms of whether you call it urban rural or smaller states versus more populous states. But those kinds of divisions between the party change over time. So that there's the notion of realignment. And we don't know if down the road in a few years, if the divisions that define the Democrat and the Republican Party will continue to be geographic, or whether there'll be some other changes. There seems to be a new division along educational levels, which could also play a role into future coalitions that the parties might be responding to.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, another question, please. A recent article our audience member read stated that the filibuster is an accident that has spun out of control. Could you please comment on this statement, please? Professor, I'll start with you.
Well, the history of it, it was an accident. Again, so if we go all the way back to the beginning of the 1800s, the Senate was trying to just clean up its rules, and it eliminated one which it didn't think was very important. And they didn't expect that that would eventually lead to a more sort of formalized process known as the filibuster. So they didn't have a lot of those things happening early on. They didn't think it was necessary to have a rule to close off the filibuster. But I would say that in the early 1900s, when the filibuster was preventing like President Wilson from getting his policies through Congress, that is when they created the cloture vote. And they have modified the cloture vote over the years when they again found that to be preventing the will of the majority. So things can happen by accident. We don't always know what the consequences of a reform might be because they're interrelated with other things that are both policy oriented and also with different kinds of rules that exist other than the filibuster.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Carter, please. Anything?
No, I have nothing to add. I think Professor Norrander did a great job.
Well, you've both done a great job. So anyway, just maybe one or two more questions here. Oh, Professor, I'm going to ask you to do this. And of course, Charlie, chime in. One thing we didn't cover is the nuclear option. Could you just comment on maybe defining the nuclear option so our audience knows when they hear it next what it's about?
So it's generally used to somehow changing the filibuster. So it was used when it changed the rules about judicial nominees. The idea was that you would be sort of blowing up the system and not allowing for criticism or concerns about nominees for either the judicial system or the executive nomination. So generally, it's a term that's used when they're thinking about changing the rules, and that the idea is that this would somehow drastically change the system.
Charlie, you want to comment on the nuclear option?
That the nuclear option isn't quite so nuclear. It's just a technical, I think it's unleashing a series of steps in which they question the rules, like Professor Norrander said, and then require a parliamentarian to weigh in on the rules. But it's not, I think Professor Norrander's right, is that they call it the nuclear option because it's preceded that it's it's something drastic that's going to threaten to upend the tradition of the Senate.
Okay. Well, ladies, I think we've exhausted questions having to do with the filibuster. I mean, probably this will be a time when people get off the air and then think, oh, I should have asked this question. But nonetheless, we're going to have to wrap up our forum now. Charlie, Barbara, I've set aside a few minutes for each of you to pull together any final thoughts or summary or whatever of today. I want to make sure that both of you send us forth, because we are going forth, with any final words of clarity, of challenge, of understanding, or even of hope. So Barbara, any last words of wisdom, please?
Any last words of wisdom? Okay.
Words of wisdom, Barbara.
So again, the filibuster is a rule in the Senate, and they can change the rules. But there's also been obstruction in the House of Representatives without a filibuster. Sometimes it was by a particular committee. The Rules Committee in the 1960s was a problem, so the House changed the structure of the Rules Committee. So over time, you have seen that both the Senate and the House will change their rules when they began to feel that those rules are not benefiting the institution as a whole.
Okay, thank you, Professor Norrander. Charly, any last inspiring thoughts, please?
Well, first, I want to thank everybody who joined here on this Saturday in the fall. Thank you for spending your time with me and inviting me to be part of your this learning. This is a really important time for our country. We have some really daunting challenges ahead of us, dealing with COVID, dealing with droughts and forest fires and all the other implications of climate change. We are in the middle of the Great Resignation, which is going to force us to address issues of workplace justice. And then there are, the attacks on voting rights and preventing citizens from voting at state and local levels, and even more alarmingly, states who are fundamentally trying to undo how votes happen, that to take away our ability to make choices at the ballot box and put them in the hands of, the legislatures or appointed people who can overturn our votes, as well as attacks on our rights to come together and demonstrate peacefully. There are lots of states who are passing laws against protests or criminalizing protests. All of that requires a Congress and a Senate that can come to the table and have difficult conversations and vote policies that are in the interest of protecting our nation and its residents. That can't happen as long as one side says, nope, I don't want to have that discussion. Imagine if you were home or you were with your spouse and you wanted to have or your child, and you wanted to have a conversation, and every time you wanted to have the conversation, they said, talk to the hands. That's what's happening in the Senate right now, that we have a minority who represents a tiny sliver of the population who are throwing up their hands and saying, no, this isn't even worthy of my time to discuss it. The Senate is supposed to be a place of deliberation. That's what our leaders are telling us. That's what history has always said. And yet there's no deliberating going on. So what I'd say to you is contact your senators and tell them that you want, that they should be fighting to fix or nix the filibuster. And I invite you, if this is something that you want to learn more about or you want to get engaged in this fight, I invite you to visit fixornixthefilibusternow.org. Or, check in with your League of Women Voters. And there are a number of educational resources on their website. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed, and I've learned so much from Professor Norrander.
As we all have. Charly, one more time, give us that little address, that fix or nix.
Fixornixthefilibusternow.org.
Okay. We'll put that in our records. So Ms. Charly Carter, thank you. And for our audience out there, everyone, that's the filibuster. The question is, Are we more informed as voters now? And what will we do with this knowledge? Something we need to ponder and act on. But before we sign off, if you please indulge with me 1 minute to thank some people essential to our forum today. Adrian Barton, Judy Wood, and Jeremy Brittle, our tech gurus. Kathy Eros, the team leader for today, and her, as she describes it, intrepid team. Nina Willis, Dee Maitland, and Elizabeth Segura. Always thanks to our Greater Tucson League President, Kate Stewart, and certainly Charly Carter and Barbara Norrander. Barbara, Charly, the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson, and our audience are grateful for your sense of justice, your years of experience in the political realm, and your enthusiasm. So thank you for putting yourself out there this day so that we could learn. So everyone, be well and safe. See you around our voter ed programs whenever you can join us. Take care. And this is the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson signing off.